Let's get started again. Please give a warm round of applause to our next speaker, Bram Adams.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. So, as Tessa mentioned, I am Bram. I really like learning a lot of things, so I'm hoping that we can do that today. We're going to be talking a little bit about creativity, which is a really big topic and kind of hard to unpack, and I love those kinds of topics. So, let's talk about creativity. So, has anyone kind of like been in a situation where you're kind of like, oh, I can't wait to get into that creative mood. I can't wait to kind of like reach that flow state, to like be writing all this kind of music or whatever you're into, or code or design, and just feel good, but then you actually end up something like this? Right? You know what I mean? You like sit there, you get to your computer, you get to your utensil of choice, and then you just freeze. You know what I mean? So I have always wondered, what's the kind of thing that prevents people from being creative? What's the kind of thing that stops us from kind of being the kind of like creative things that we want to be like? So first off, we got to ask, what is creativity? And I actually have to sidebar for a second. Are we doing the questions? Is that the thing?
That's fine. Yes.
Is there like an app, or how does it work?
Yes, at the end.
Okay, all right.
But you can still ask.
Okay, so one of the questions that I was going to ask is I wanted to give kind of like a straw poll about what people think creativity is. So do you think it's imitation? That's the first one. Inspiration, divine inspiration from some muse or God. Intuition, or sweat and tears? Can we get some raised hands for, let's start at the top. Imitation? One. Inspiration? More, okay. Intuition, all right, pretty much the same number, maybe a bit less. Sweat and tears, cool, yeah, also the same number. So you guys are right, it's kind of a combination of a lot of different things. To kind of like start doing the research for this, I wanted to see how Merriam-Webster defined creativity, because they tend to be pretty objective. But their definition wasn't that helpful. So then I was like, okay, maybe I'll check create. So create has a lot of different things to bring into existence, but the one that I thought was most interesting was to produce through an imaginative skill. Okay, so what's imagination? So imagination is, let's just read this. The act or power of forming a mental image of something not present to the senses or never before wholly perceived in reality. Now that's interesting. So something that was never existing and is brought into existing. Right? Cool. So let's talk a little bit about a brief history lesson of what other smart people throughout time have thought about creativity. So the ancient Indians and the ancient Greeks mainly thought that creativity was imitation. So they didn't really have a concept for creativity. They kind of assumed that creativity was you're watching a bird fly, ergo you just copy what the bird is doing, right? So nature was this kind of ideal, and everybody who was human was trying to strive to that ideal. So creativity is a form of imitation. During the Enlightenment period, this is when people started to get real humanistic. They started doing the whole scientific method thing. That thing got started. Everybody was thinking, no, we are the owners of our own destiny. And then they started saying that creativity is a form of imagination, which is a bit closer to what we have today, where it's human-driven. So you take a lot of different inputs, and then you creatively make an output. And we'll get a little bit to that later. And then there's the modern day, which is a form of evolution. So kind of what the question was a little bit of a distraction, because the current thinking of creativity is that it's more of a process than anything. So you can actually tap into your creative spirit at any time if you're willing to follow the steps. So the first step, preparation. You want to focus your mind on the problem's dimensions. So you kind of want to get a good idea of what the problem is that you're trying to solve. Why is it important? Why are you motivated to be solving this problem? What are you up to? Incubation, so this is when you let the problem go into your unconscious mind. So there's the conscious focusing of a problem, and there's the subconscious focusing of the problem. I'm a big fan of the Daniel Kahneman System 1, System 2 type thinking. I don't know if anyone read the book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a great book. And the unconscious mind is kind of in charge of all the things that we do. And the incubation period for creativity is where that happens in your unconscious mind. Intimation, which is, I thought when I first read this was imitation, and I pronounced it as such, but it's intimation, is the feeling that a creative solution is on its way. So that's the kind of like, that like you kind of like look at something and you're like, oh wow, that kind of reminds me of something else, you know what I mean? Or you feel like something's going on in your brain, something's stewing in there, and it sounds like it's going to be pretty sweet, right? and then illumination. So then the creative idea bursts into consciousness, which sounds violent, but it's not. It's usually just good. You come up with like the start of Moonlight Sonata or something like that, and then you form the whole thing around it. So Thomas Edison is really famous for doing a lot of incubation period stuff. So basically what he would do is that when he was struggling with a really hard problem, he would go to sleep. But he wouldn't just go to sleep. He would hold these steel balls in his hand, and right before he fell asleep, because your body paralyzes itself when it goes to sleep, so that you don't just walk out and just fall anywhere while you're dreaming, he would drop the balls, and they would fall into these large metal pans on the ground and wake him up immediately. And then he would write down the first thing that came to his mind, because usually what would happen was that he would be solving the problem right before he fell asleep, because he's accessing what I'll refer to later. So let's talk a little bit about Vue, right? Because this is a Vue talk. So one of the things that I was thinking about, how do creativity and Vue align? What's the big deal about Vue versus React versus Angular versus Go versus all the other languages and kind of just the computers in general, right? So I think that the main thing that I discovered is that your tools shouldn't get in your way. You shouldn't feel limited by the tools that you're using when you're trying to create something. So this is the quote from Vue's About page, which I think is dope, because they're like, okay, we want this to be incrementally adoptable. We want something that is easily used, something that's easily picked up, and something that is easily added to your project. You should be able to play around with the tools that you're given, as opposed to feeling like the tools are something that you need to learn before you can start being creative. So here's an example of setting up a Markdown HTML. I didn't include the HTML or the CSS or the result, because it's kind of just to make a proof of concept here of how kind of not only few lines. When we talk about coding, a lot of the times that people argue over optimizations. They argue over hey, am I setting up the optimal way of doing this type of code? Am I using recursion or iterative? What's my big O? None of that really ends up mattering most of the time. Kind of like what Heather was saying with the UX thing, is that we kind of want just ease of use for the people who are going to be reading it later, right? So we want the lines to kind of just be easily legible and easily understandable, and that's what makes Vue great. So why is Vue so popular among developers? So this is the React versus Vue star count from earlier today, actually. So it's live, you know what I mean? I hope you guys are taking bets at home, because Vue is pretty hot right now, and I'm starting to both, because I don't choose teams like that. I'm like the Swiss. So this is the guy who created React, actually, and he has I think a really good point at this last sentence here, where we're choosing different trade-offs, and it'll be exciting to where they take us, because he wants to see less arguments of who's best. So I think that that's kind of really sums up the kind of different philosophies of the different tools, and that the situations that are correct for React aren't necessarily correct for Vue. And if you're trying to be more creative, I would argue that it's probably best to use Vue. And the reason is because there are a lot of baseline tools and a gentle learning curve. Again, kind of as I was stressing earlier, your tools shouldn't get in the way of the creative process that you're trying to do. You should be able to just get off on the ground running, and let your mind do what your mind does best, and then be able to convert that into things that exist in reality. So let's talk a little bit about enhancing your creativity. So again, this I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the System 1 versus System 2, but this is from Learning How to Learn, and it talks about focus versus diffuse thinking. So basically, focused thinking over here, we see that your mind is kind of just running through the same two solutions. You can imagine that this is kind of just like a little animal, just running around in a box without being able to find a way out, because you're just kind of running over the same problem over and over again. When you go to sleep, or when you do something else, go for a walk, when you're listening to an audiobook, when you're doing the dishes, driving your car, no one drives in New York, but you get the point. You access diffuse thinking. Diffuse thinking opens your mind space. It allows your mind to kind of look at different options and look at the problem from completely different settings and different use cases, right? So this is really helpful because, well, for a few reasons, is that it's a lot slower, so you won't be able to come up with a solution immediately, but the solution that you come up with will be generally pretty novel, which is what we want with creativity. So consume books. I put this in caps because I think it's that important. If you want to create better output, you need better inputs. and you want to have as many different high quality inputs as possible. There's a lot of good books out there. There are a lot of bad books out there, but you need to be able to have the different knowledge to be able to form the different kind of talking points that you need to understand about the world to create better web apps for your users, as well as just better products in general, because that's what we do. We create products, right? Problem solutions. Flow state. So I never know how to pronounce his name, but there's a guy who wrote the book Flow, back in the 90s. And basically, I'm a huge proponent of the flow state when it comes to creativity. I can't get like any work done on my own. So like basically what I'll have to do is I have this forest app on my phone where it has this little cartoon tree, and you set a timer, and if you check your other apps on your phone, the tree dies. So basically the whole point is that you sit for 25 minutes or 40 minutes or 15 minutes or 5 minutes, and you just kind of work at the thing that you're working at. And one of the nice things about this is that it kind of lowers the barrier of entry. If you kind of go into a problem and you are stuck in the focused mode where you're kind of like so worried about the end result, you're never actually going to be able to see the forest for the trees. You're going to see this huge project in front of you, and you're not actually just going to be able to focus on the module or the header or whatever you're working on, right? Finally, create without judgment. So I think that this has kind of like been covered a lot. A lot of people say like your first draft is shit, and it is. You know what I mean? Like everybody's first draft of anything, like Michelangelo didn't just strike a piece of marble and then David fell out. That's not what happened. You know? So like you kind of just gotta like look at your first product and you just gotta like do it. You gotta ship it. You know what I mean? Like I really like this quote because I think that it kind of like allows people to be like, hey, this is a very successful person who created a very successful thing, but it was very much iterated on. It very much started as crap and then became less crap over time. But yeah, so that's pretty much it. Thank you for listening.